Hi, today we're going to be talking about accelerating agility and access in Azure with CDW's Azure Enterprise Service Catalog. My name is Casey Bleeker, and I'm the GM of our cloud business at Digital Velocity within CDW. Digital Velocity is our SI arm. We have over 1,000 engineers and architects across cloud native solutions, software engineering, data architecture, and AI/ML. And we're working in some of the world's largest Azure deployments, delivering on our clients' digital transformation needs. Today, we're going to be talking about how the enterprise service catalog approach from Digital Velocity is transforming the way our clients consume and use Azure. Cloud, specifically with Azure's capabilities, is enabling massive digital transformation, but it's also forcing the transformation of legacy or traditional IT operating patterns. The cloud pattern of deploying resources, applications, services quickly and on demand and through self-service, it's a massive enabler of agility and speed in an organization. And never before has that been more critical to businesses than today. But that also means that often individual lines of business, individual application owners or development teams, they're looking for their own teams to have the ability to provision and deploy and access the power of Azure Cloud. But that sprawl of access, what we used to call shadow IT, we now call agility. And shadow IT as a term is really just a symptom of individual lines of business or software application development teams not being properly served by their IT organization and going around existing process to be able to execute on their business requirements. The problem is that a centralized IT stakeholder is thinking in kind of a traditional mindset that I don't want HR or my data teams or the e-commerce or a web application team to be able to go broadly make changes or deploy their own infrastructure. Because then they end up with snowflakes all over the place. They don't have a view to consistent security, compliance, governance, cost control. And without those centralized cost management tooling, how can they even measure how much as an organization they're using or show a department level spend? So they want to lock down access to ensure that all of that is addressed. And that's a valid goal or a valid requirement. But what ends up happening is we have organizations and lines of business that move around those processes. And this is a trade-off we see consistently across the companies we work with. The IT stakeholder says either I give people access or I restrict access to ensure security, compliance, and governance, and therefore restrict the speed and agility of my business and our time to market. Well, we can eliminate this trade-off between agility and governance. And there are three key dependencies to successfully adopt to eliminate this trade-off. First, and really I think one of the most critical, is we have to change our mentality to one of IT as a service provider within our organization. We need to think of governance as an enabler to speed and cloud adoption, not a barrier. A simple way for us to kind of think about this is that every requirement we provide our organization, it also needs to come with an acceleration. For every no, there needs to be a yes, a way in which we remove the expertise or skill required to adopt cloud at scale. Second, we have to align the organization on what our cloud strategy and definition will be. There are many approaches in the industry today, but one that is gaining traction is the Cloud Center of Excellence. And sometimes you'll hear that abbreviated as a CCOE. A CCOE, or a Cloud Center of Excellence, is a great model for an organization to have cross-functional stakeholders come together to define the way in which they adopt cloud, what those cloud patterns mean to their organization, and to define the enterprise standards so that the CCOE and the IT organization can be a service to the business, providing those predefined standards and not act as a gatekeeper. And the CCOE should also be able to answer questions such as, who and how will we operate and support our Azure cloud environment? What does hybrid cloud mean to our organization? Is that Azure Arc at the edge? Does that mean hybrid cloud interconnectivity between our private data centers? How do we secure our cloud workloads? And how do we transform and support our application teams into cloud teams? So the CCOE is a critical motion in many different flavors and forms and scale to be able to answer those critical questions. And then thirdly and lastly, we have to put this mentality and these definitions into practice. And this is where many organizations, they don't know how to progress forward in applying the standards without impeding the organizational agility. Enter the service catalog approach. We can leverage cloud-native automation patterns and practices to apply best practices to all of our organization's cloud resources, however they choose to deploy them. In the CCOE, we're defining these security, compliance, and governance requirements in a standardized set of modules and the associated automation required to deploy them into our Azure cloud environment. And this creates a set list of enterprise-approved architectures and standards that individuals across the business can then leverage. We can expose these modules or standards in a catalog to end users throughout the organization in many different ways. Maybe less technical individuals can open up a ticket to click to request resources, such as I'd like to deploy a web server, just by opening a ticket. Some organizations we've worked with have even brought this in as a Power Virtual Agent chatbot in Microsoft Teams, where they can just chat with a virtual assistant to request the cloud resources they need. We also expose this catalog to developers through CI/CD pipelines, through tools such as Azure DevOps, so that now development workflows across our organizations don't have to change either, and they can be programmatically accessible. So now individual lines of business and individual application teams have self-service access to all the standards that are predefined for them. Our IT and our governance bodies are not impeding their agility or their ability to deploy or access or configure their Azure cloud. And they're also ensuring standardization of IT requirements that we would normally want to apply in a standardized motion. We're basically taking concepts that have already been broadly adopted across the business and applying DevOps or infrastructure as code and using that as the mechanism to apply IT governance. So let's talk for a minute about what this looks like in practice. First, the standards defined by that Cloud Center of Excellence, or CCOE, they're codified into modules known as infrastructure as code, or sometimes you'll see that abbreviated as IAC. We build DevOps pipeline processes through tools like Azure DevOps to automate applying these modules so that when cloud resources are requested, they're deployed automatically to adhere to enterprise requirements and can even go through an internal approval process in your traditional IT service management workflows in tools like ServiceNow. Next, we change where most individuals would normally manually access or provision or deploy cloud resources from the native Azure console to the enterprise's own service catalog. And that could be through an ITSM tool like ServiceNow, or it could be a custom web development UI or control plane. And we built various different interfaces for our clients depending on their needs of how their organization best wants to access a service catalog. This enforces a consistent pattern of all resources that are deployed and configured, but it's also an accelerator to individuals without the skills needed to deploy in a modern automated pattern. Where somebody in IT might traditionally manually go and configure something due to a request that came in, now it's done with automation, so it's done repeatedly and consistently the same way. Critically, we also expose this catalog to application and cloud operations resources through infrastructure as code parameters. So when a developer checks in code to a source control system, such as GitHub, complex configurations and resource tagging, permissions, individual application parameters, those can all be handled for them by applying those predefined enterprise standards. And the variables that you do choose to allow individual lines of business, such as maybe the compute resources required, memory, number of instances, or location, those can be defined by each line of business in their own code. Here's a really simple use case to help bring this home. If I'm a web developer and I want to go deploy a web server, if I go into a console natively or I deploy it through my own infrastructure as code, that's going to be different every time I do it. And if I have 50 different web developers across my business, we're going to get 50 different types of deployments and 50 different types of architectures. And if I had to request these through a legacy IT process, I'd have a long delay and a back and forth defining requirements. So I might just choose to do it myself. But if you said our enterprise approved architecture for a web server includes these components deployed in this way, that can be defined in code. And now when the developer says, I want a web server, they can deploy it in a standardized form with all of the prior security patterns, resource tagging, and performance configurations that have already been defined at an enterprise level. And because of that standardization, you now know how many resources each department or each organization within an individual line of business is consuming. You can start to adopt and implement things like FinOps, which show department level bill back or show back of their cloud utilization. But most importantly, the resource requested is being deployed in a consistent and standardized manner. So you're not slowing the individual developer or the line of business stakeholder down, and what they're provisioning is being deployed through infrastructure as code pipelines with the enterprise standards. And all your users don't even have to have the underlying infrastructure as code or automation or DevOps knowledge. They don't have to be a software delivery lifecycle expert. We can architect and deploy those automation pipelines on the back end of a service catalog. That ultimately means you're expanding the number of users who are adopting modern DevOps and automation principles. And this improves the resiliency and security of your Azure cloud environment. So some of the benefits. Using a service catalog leads to more benefits than just solving the cloud trade-off between agility and standardization. By expanding the number of resources using this DevOps pattern, you're overall increasing the reliability, security, mean time to recovery of your entire cloud architecture. The service catalog removes a lot of the complexity for these stakeholders. Maybe deploying that web application, it would include the firewall, the load balancer, containerized infrastructure, maybe a Kubernetes cluster on AKS, the logging and observability, the networking and identity security constraints, all of the things that a web developer may not have needed to know or even known how to implement. So this becomes an accelerator. You're applying the governance, the perceived know, but you're accelerating their adoption of self-service deployment of reliable and well-architected environments. And these templates can be accessed again and again. So architecting a solution once gives huge repeatability across the organization. So this is probably one of the most common patterns we're engaging with in enterprise organizations, all the way down to mid-sized corporations. Our clients want to know how they can help their organization adopt cloud, but at the same time, how they can meet the standards of IT compliance, security, and governance. And there's no playbook or standard for how, for example, a large retail chain, for example, would adopt cloud. But in this scenario, they can decide what are their standards, what are their compliance and security and governance requirements, what are their approval requirements, how much should every department or line of business be allowed to spend, and what are the types of things they should be able to deploy. Our Digital Velocity professional services and consulting practice at CDW will help you evaluate how to best establish a cloud center of excellence. We'll help you to define the standards for your organization and implement the automation required to expose those standards to your users as an Azure Enterprise Service Catalog. And when you define how your organization will adopt cloud in a standardized manner and distributed broad access to all your stakeholders, you've answered how your organization is going to adopt and scale and manage cloud responsibly and securely without impeding your business agility. Thank you very much, and I look forward to connecting with you if you have interest.